Is it possible to pay Hashem off if we're in trouble? Rashi is going to analyze how in the Torah it tells us in this week's parasha that there are two ways that we could curry favor with Hashem, either by what we do or possibly by who we are. The pasuk says that Hashem, your God, is the God of all gods, who does not show favor, nor does he accept bribes. Rashi explains, what does that mean? Lo yisafonim, the Eibishter will not show you favor, if you reject his authority. Lo yikach sheichad, and he will not accept a bribe, is lefaisa b'momen, that you cannot placate Hashem with money, as if you imagined you could. It's one of the things we'll have to analyze. First of all, the question is, how come it is, what's Rashi telling us that we don't already know? That if a person rejects Hashem's authority, Hashem's not going to show them favor. Surely that is self-understood. What would we have thought? That Hashem would not show us favor if we do Torah and mitzvahs? So what's he teaching us? Some Mefarshim biru, there are Mefarshim who comment on this. Rashi b'dvarav bali yashav stir ben shnei ksuvim, that Rashi is actually looking over here to settle what appears to be a contradiction between two psukim, one which is very well known to us. Shekan nemar lo yisafonim. Here the pasuk says Hashem does not show favor. Whereas in Birkas Kohanim earlier in Parshas Nosoi, there it says Hashem will show you favor. Seems to be a contradiction. Therefore Rashi has to explain, well, this scenario is different to the one over there in Parshas Nosei, because here we're talking about people who reject Hashem's authority. So in Birkas Kohanim it implies that the bracha is if we're listening, and here that Hashem does not show us favor if we don't listen. Problem is that also doesn't make sense. And again, why do you have to tell me that? Surely it's self-evident. Surely it follows logically that the Eibishter will not show you favor if you reject him. Especially when you consider all of the detail the Torah already gave us in Parshas B'chukoisai about what happens if we reject Hashem. So now you have to tell me this big surprise and he won't show you favor. Plus, the analysis of Birkas Kohanim isn't as simple as we thought. Void. When it says that the Eibishter will show you favor, look at what Rashi says. Pirish Rashi, it means that the Eibishter will stem his anger to you, overcome his anger. In other words, which means that Birkas Kohanim is actually talking about a scenario where we have angered Hashem. And then there must be a reason why Hashem is angry, which is Hashem, because we behaved in a way that is contrary to what the Eibishter wants. Is that not rejecting his authority? And nevertheless, the pasuk there says, Yisha Hashem Panav, that the Eibishter will anyway still show you favor. In which case, there is still a contradiction between Birkas Kohanim and our pasuk. Our pasuk is saying Hashem will not show you favor if you reject him, and the pasuk in Birkas Kohanim implies that Hashem will still show you favor even if you reject him. So that's the first thing we need to understand. What's Rashi telling us by saying that Hashem doesn't show us favor if we reject his authority? Then let's analyze the second commentary that Rashi gave us. Now this really doesn't seem to make sense, that Rashi is suggesting that Hashem will not accept bribery means actual cash. We can understand why Rashi added the word lefaisoi, that the idea and intention of it is to somehow placate Hashem. And we understand why Rashi has to add that expression of placation, even though the Torah said bribery. The reason for that, as the Re'im comments on Rashi, and it's actually self-explanatory, is mishum usually when we talk about bribery, which is typically in regards to a human judge, there are various ways, or at least two ways that you can interpret what bribery is. It is possible you bribe somebody to skew justice, to corrupt justice, to claim that a guilty person is innocent. The other option is, or if the person is headed for some kind of punishment, to mitigate the punishment, to kind of pay themselves off. So therefore, says the Re'im Hashem Yisbarach lo yipoy bo lezakas es hachayev. There's no way that the Eibishter would ever misjudge and claim that a guilty person is innocent. Rak levater ha'inish. The Eibishter is only going to forgive us perhaps a degree of the punishment. Which is exactly why Rashi explains that the kind of bribery we're talking about over here is to placate Hashem, to mitigate the punishment that might come towards a person. Not to find an excuse for somebody who is guilty, because the Torah doesn't have to tell us that you can't convince the Eibishter to exonerate somebody who is guilty, because that could never happen. So we get it what Rashi says, lefaya soy. So we'd have that clarity of what kind of sheikhah we're talking about. But money? Why does Rashi say money? As the Re'im asks about Rashi, I don't understand how money falls into the conversation about the Eibishter. What, are you going to pay the Eibishter cash? Why doesn't he, says the Re'im, why doesn't Rashi say that you might want to try bribe Hashem with extra mitzvahs to compensate for the Aveira that a person did that they deserved some punishment for? And following on with that, how come Rashi doesn't includes in his heading the words lo yikach? He's explaining the word shoichad. He's defining for us what shoichad is. That right? That's what he's explaining. What is bribery in this context? Where Rashi is first clarifying that it means to placate, and that the methodology you're going to use is money. Who needs the words lo yikach? Okay, so the Re'im's question is, what has money to do with this? Surely it should have been that we're presenting the Eibishter with a mitzvah in order to try and, so to speak, change the course of what's coming our way. So we're going to see that there are three explanations to try and answer the Re'im's question. What does it mean, money? How do you give money to the Eibishter? Number one, the first suggestion is, we don't mean money as in you're going to pay a debt, so to speak, on the Eibishter's behalf or give tzedakah, but it actually means to buy a korban. And to that, the pasuk tells us it doesn't work that way, because when a Russia brings a korban, it's actually an abomination. And therefore, Eibishter is not going to accept your korban, and that's going to clarify the situation. You actually have to do tshuva as well. That's explanation number one. Explanation number two broadens it. Base. That actually what it means to give money to the Eibishter is any donation that goes to something of holy nature. That a person would think if they make a contribution to the Beis HaMikdash, or in those days to the Mishkan, that would be considered something that would mitigate the punishment they deserve for an Aveira. Therefore, so the Pasuk has to clarify that a person cannot excuse themselves from the responsibility they have for an Aveira by donating to the Beis HaMikdash, etc. The only thing you have to do is you got to do tshuva. That's the way to fix it. And lastly, the broadest explanation of mammon is any mitzvah that has a cost implication. Could go in tzedakah, the most obvious being tzedakah, or other things that you have to spend money. And the Torah is telling us, well, the Eibishter is not going to accept a financial compensation. You have to do teshuvah. Okay, these are beautiful explanations to the Re'im's question. What is money? It does not answer the question, why? These answers only address what is the secondary question the Re'im asked, which was, how is it even factually possible to give the Eibishter money? Okay, you could give a korban, donate to the Beis HaMikdash, give tzedakah. But the main question the Re'im raised is still a valid question. Now that we've suggested the possibility that there is such a thing as bribery, so to speak, in the Eibishter's reality, and the way to achieve that bribery is through money. And we have to clarify that it's going to be different money to if you were trying to bribe a human, where the recipient of the bribe, the judge, actually has value. He could use the money for something. But here, ultimately, the Eibishter doesn't use the money of the Beis HaMikdash or of our tzedakah or even of the korban. It's that we're using that money to perform a mitzvah. Well, then we're back to square one. Havas korban, the mitzvah, bringing a korban, or tzedakah, etc. If that's the case, we're back to square one. Loma nokat Rashi b'yichud mitzvah shehi b'momen. If ultimately we're actually illustrating examples of various mitzvahs, yes, admittedly, financially bound mitzvahs, but mitzvahs nonetheless, why does Rashi say that the means of sheichad is money? He should have just said, Ma'ishna mitzvah shali denesinas momen mikol shara mitzvahs. He should have just said, you're trying to bribe the Eibishter with a mitzvah. What's the fundamental difference between a mitzvah that is specific to a money investment versus a regular mitzvah? Or befrat kosher. And it's particularly difficult when you consider ala pirusha medubar hu b'korban, when you go with the first opinion who suggests, well, we're talking over here about a korban. What's the definition of a korban? Shuhu nichoyach nachas ruach lefonai, that it gives the Eibishter pleasure. Ha'heifech mikasa, which is the opposite of anger. Rashi should have said it. If that opinion is correct, Rashi should have said, you placate Hashem, nachas ruach, how? Through a korban which is designed to create nachas ruach. It would be, it's a strange roundabout way to allude to what he means, that it's a korban by saying money, and then you have to work out that the money equals a korban. Void. The Pirush Zenim Tzeho'ikar Chosim and Asefa Pirush Rashi. And if you are going with any of these explanations, then the main point of Rashi is unclear, which is Sha'af, Sha'korban Mechaper. We're saying over here, bring a korban, but that's not going to work, because even though a korban will atone Eina Dvarim Amurim Ela Keshiyeshim Tshuva, that only works when there's tshuva. Why doesn't Rashi tell us that? V'yoid, B'pshut Shel Mikra, and then lastly, going back to the pasuk itself, Heicha Nirmez Al Kol Ponim B'Masha Kosav Lo Yikach Sheichad. In those words that the Eibishter will not accept a bribe, where's the even a remote clue or hint to the fact that a korban is ineffective if there's no tshuva? Where do you see that in the words? And don't suggest, this is actually quite a far-fetched suggestion, that why did Rashi associate bribery with money? Because that's how we experience bribery. Because the normal human go-to expression of bribery is financial. You can't say that. Number one, we know very well in halacha that it is possible to bribe people in other ways, not only with money, even with compliments. Famous stories in the Gemara that a person did something for a judge and he said, I can't judge your case, even though it was something that he was hired to do, or the person who greeted the judge or was nice to him. In other words, we understand that bribery extends beyond money. That'd be a really far-fetched reason to suggest that Rashi says bribery equals money. And Beis, most importantly, Ve'ikar, the pasuk is still unclear. Lama nemar bakosuv sheichad. Why did the Torah, in the first place, say that the Eibishter does not accept bribery, which will naturally link and interpret in our minds into something financial? Why doesn't it say, I don't know, something that would have implied that there's nothing that we could do, even spiritually, to, so to speak, mitigate the Eibishter's harshness against us. So we need to understand what's Rashi telling us about these two things. Lo yisafanim is specifically when we reject Hashem's authority, and lo yikach sheichad is specifically money, which is so surprising. So habir bozeh, the explanation, let's start with the first commentary that Rashi made. Kavanas pirush Rashi kan meduyekes b'lashono. If we pay attention to the specific choice of words that Rashi uses, it gives us all the information we need. What does he say? Im tefaruku uloi. When will Hashem not show you favor? When you reject his authority. And Rashi could have and didn't choose any of the other expressions of rebellion or rejection of Hashem or sin. Doesn't use any of them, even those that are used in the context of B'chul Koisai. Why is that? Because Rashi wants us to be clear. There are many ways in which a person could misbehave, many things where a person could either not do a mitzvah or outright transgress. That's not what we're talking about here. In fact, if a person has done averos or skipped mitzvahs that they were supposed to do, we have a tefillah, we have a bracha that addresses that. That even if we've done things that anger Hashem, that Hashem should show us favor anyway and not punish us anyway. That is regular rejection of mitzvahs or transgressions. But here Rashi says is a unique category in tefaruku oil. Ela medubar al prikas oil. Here we're talking specifically about a person who has some degree of chutzpah, of rejecting Hashem's authority. This is not somebody who's just done an avera here or an avera there, who missed the opportunity to do a mitzvah. This is a person who wholesale rejects Hashem's authority. Is completely losing the title of being a servant of Hashem. Instead, here we're describing somebody who feels completely free to do as they please. This is a person who says, I am going to follow the dictates of my own heart. Such a person with such a dramatic rejection of Hashem. That's what the Eibishter says, not going to show you favor. The Eibishter is going to be absolutely specific and very precise in the reaction without any compromise. You've rejected me completely. There's no special treatment. Why is Rashi so convinced that is the interpretation? Because of the context of the parasha. This parasha began by saying, you Jewish people, what does Eibishter request of you, ask of you? Only to fear him. How does Rashi explain that? Appears Rashi. Even though you did all kinds of things that you weren't meant to do, his compassion and his benevolence or his love towards you are still there. And with all the averos that you did, the only thing that the Eibishter is asking is, have all of Hashem. But still have Kabbalah Soul. Hare, in other words. So take a particular parasha right at the beginning of this particular section in the Torah. It's highlighting, we're talking about a scenario of people who have done things that are wrong. And nevertheless, HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows upon Yisrael, the Eibishter will still forgive. The Eibishter will accommodate. The Eibishter will show them favor. And will just ask one thing, just fear me. Kabbalah Sol, nothing else. That's the introduction to the section. Therefore, when we look at the next phase, where there's a suggestion that there's a scenario where the Eibishter will not show us any favor, the only explanation could be, because we already know that our averos are not going to cause him not to show us favor, as long as we fear him. So what's the only reason that people that would lose that favor from Hashem? Must be people who are not fearing Hashem. When a person is behaving in the completely opposite direction, prikas oil, rejecting Hashem's authority, it's not possible that they could fear Hashem. And that's Rashi's explanation. What does it mean? Where is the scenario that Eibishter will not show you favor if chas v'shalom we completely reject Hashem? That will explain why Rashi in the next explanation cannot explain as many of the others like the Ramban do. That bribery in this context is the bribery of mitzvahs. Why not? Look at the context. The way Rashi is interpreting this pasuk based on the context of the parasha. That who is the person that Hashem won't show favor? Somebody who doesn't have fear of heaven, who has rejected Hashem's authority. So then Shuvay Mokum Leforsha V'lo Yikach Sheichad Hainu Shakadosh Baruch Hu Eino Lokech Sheichad Mitzvahs Mi Perek O. Well, then you can't say somebody who's rejected Hashem's authority, Hashem's not going to accept their mitzvahs as a so-called bribe. Because we've already rejected the possibility of this person's mitzvahs having value in Hashem's eyes, because they're not doing mitzvahs, and more importantly, they've wholesale rejected the authority of Hashem. So there's no space to talk about. And now if they do mitzvahs, it should help them. Valkein, Rashi. Therefore, Rashi has to find an alternative where there is a logical basis that there has to be something that is strong enough or meaningful enough to achieve forgiveness, or at least favor from Hashem, even for a person who has rejected Hashem. What could that be? Can't be their mitzvahs. The mitzvahs, so to speak, have no value. Therefore, Rashi says, this bribery we're talking about over here to try to placate Hashem is money. Why? What about money? Rashi doesn't even have to explain clearly to us why money has this incredible power to be able to so-called placate Hashem when nothing else is working. Because we've already learned this principle earlier, which is when we spoke about in Parashas Maseh about the person who inadvertently kills somebody else. The Torah says, do not accept a financial compensation for the person who has killed somebody else or murdered somebody else. So Rashi is the one who tells us means financial compensation. By the way, in Parashas Mishpatim, we have a similar thing. When you have an ox that kills a person, Nemar also says that you know the way that the person compensates with the payment that he makes is pidyon nafshoy, that there's a financial way of redeeming or atoning for his soul. Move on. That explains to us that when a person uses finance, money, as a bribe, it has a dual value and purpose. The first thing that happens is you give somebody money, they are now biased, they have been bribed. Because they've got benefit from the fact that they have money or that they received money from you, and that in itself is fundamentally going to shift their perspective. But besides that, that's common to any kind of bribery. Besides that, when we're talking about giving money in the context of what the Torah expects, the money has an element, a capacity to atone. Pidyon v'chilef lenoisen. It becomes the redemption or the replacement of the person who is giving the money who should have been punished. Where instead of this person having to hand themselves over and possibly pass away, when he gives his money. And when it comes to the penalty that a person has to pay if their ox killed a person, Rashi quotes an opinion from the Gemara that you don't pay the value of the victim, you pay the value of the owner of the ox, because he is the one who needs to atone, so the money has to reflect his persona. Why is that? How does money have this power? So the Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya. And it makes sense, midah keneged midah, because that's how all kinds of mitzvahs work, or all kinds of interactions with us and Hashem. Midah keneged midah, what we put in is what we get out. Like it says in a negative way about the Mitzrayim, that the way that they mistreated the Jewish people is eventually what came back to bite them. But the Alter Rebbe explains it clearly and in detail with regards to tzedakah, which is because money is something I could have used to buy the things that I need in order to live. If I give away that money, I'm effectively giving away the source of my life. That's why it's so close to giving up one's own life. As Rashi says, it's close by in the pasuk, hayakum asher b'raglein, that they went with the yakum, which is their assets that were with their feet. Says Rashi, this refers to a person's money, which puts them on their feet. In other words, my stability, my sustainability, my sustenance is all completely dependent on money. Give away the money, it's like giving away myself. Therefore, shoichad momen is something to consider. Paying money for the Eibishter's, so to speak, needs is something worth considering as potentially a way to mitigate punishment, etc. That's why the Torah has to tell us, despite the incredible power of money as a means of kapara, it doesn't work when you're trying to bribe Hashem. Pshita goes without saying. Remember, we said the two elements of bribery. The one element of bribery is that it affects and corrupts the perspective of the person who receives the bribe. That's not possible in the Eibishter's context. There is nothing in the world that we could give the Eibishter that would change the Eibishter's mind, that would create a bias. It's impossible to suggest that. But there's another component of money, which is there's the impact of the giving of that money on the giver of the money. A person could think that even though here's somebody who's completely rejected Hashem and is not dedicated to Hashem, but don't worry, I'll pay money, and that is the equivalent of, so to speak, sacrificing myself. The Eibishter will accept it as my atonement. That is a valid argument that the Torah has to reject. Therefore, the Pasuk has to say the Eibishter is not going to accept your money as a way of atoning for something which is so dramatic as rejecting Hashem completely. It's not that the Eibishter is not going to accept money to sway his opinion. He's not going to accept the atonement attribute within that money. Where you can replace yourself with something. The person has to hand themselves over, has to dedicate themselves to Hashem. And then there's value in giving your money. But giving the money, like we said earlier, some of the commentaries responding to the Re'aim, giving a korban doesn't work without tshuva. Giving money doesn't work without a person accepting Kabbalah soul. As long as a person rejects Hashem's authority, the Eibishter is not willing to accept the money which has the capacity to atone for them. It's not going to work. That's why Rashi has to include in the headline that he's going to explain not only the word sheichad, so you should understand what it means, but which aspect of sheichad. Lo yikach is not going to take sheichad. Because we're describing over here where a person is donating money which is the source of their sustenance to Hashem, and therefore it's like they're handing themselves over to Hashem, Kabbalas oil, which is supposed to represent accepting Hashem's authority. And in this case we're talking about somebody who's not handing themselves over and not willing to accept Hashem's authority, and therefore the donation of money is not going to help them to be able to achieve that atonement. Therefore the Pasuk has to emphasize over here, not to say giving the money doesn't talk to Hashem, but rather that the Eibishter is not going to accept that money to fulfill the role that money could normally fulfill, which is kofer. The Eibishter is not going to take it from you. It's not going to accept it as a means of atonement. Now, everything specifically Torah related is about precise divine providence. And it so happens, b'ashgacha pratis, that we typically read this parasha at the same time we're reading the same theme in Pirkei Avos. These two facets, that the Eibishter will not show us favor, nor will he accept compensation from us if we reject his authority. And Tzagam B'Seif HaPerek HaRevi B'Maseches Avos is also right at the end of the fourth perek of Pirkei Avos. That in front of the Eibishter there is no way that you could, so to speak, pull the wool over Hashem's eyes. And there is no way to, so to speak, get Hashem to show us favor. And the Eibishter does not accept sheichad bribery. According to the opinion we follow, which is to study Pirkei Avos right through the Sam all the way to Rosh Hashanah, so many years, most years, like this year, Eikev, we learned that fourth perek on Shabbos Parashas Eikev. And when you look at Rashi's explanation on our pasuk, it answers the question, which is, what is the Mishnah adding that the Torah didn't already tell us? The Torah said, Lo yisapanim. What does the Mishnah say? Lo yimasei panim. The Torah says, Lo yikach sheichad. What does the Mishnah say? Lo yimakach sheichad. What's the difference? But the way that we've explained Rashi's perspective, you can actually see the distinction between what the pasuk has told us and what the Mishnah is telling us. Remember, Rashi arrived at his explanation based on the context, which is, what does the Eibishter want from you? Just one thing, Yiras Hashem, that's it. And that's what contextualized for us. And when we're speaking in this parasha about bribery, it means bribery in the context of somebody who rejects the Eibishter completely. Which is why Rashi explains, bearing in mind that Rashi's attitude is always the most simple, direct translation of what the Torah is telling us, that when's the Eibishter not going to show you favor if you reject him? Because that's the context, and you're not doing it. And he's not going to accept your bribe. And if you try and give him money, which is chai nafsha, it's not going to work. Whereas the attitude and approach of Mishnah is a little different, and this is Pirkei Avos. We're talking in Pirkei Avos specifically with which, as the Gemara implies in Baba Kama, is Midah de Chassidusa, telling us how to behave in a way that is beyond the requirements of the law. Then we have to explain. When it says over here in this Mishnah that in front of the Eibishter there is no such concept as showing favor or accepting bribes, this is not talking about the person who is poirek uloi. That's pshat. But this is Pirkei Avos. Pirkei Avos is not addressing rebels. Pirkei Avos is addressing people who are committed to the Eibishter and need to do midah de chassidusa. Here we're talking about somebody who is observing Torah mitzvahs. But now we're expecting them to go to the next level and do things which are beyond the requirement. You see the Rambam say this by way of introduction to Pirush HaMishnayos. Sorry, not by way on this Mishnah. Lo yikach shoichad means that they should want to accept shoichad hatoivos. That if a person tries to negotiate goodness that they've done to mitigate bad things that they've done. Sheyasel them 1,000 toivos v'ro achas. If a person's done 1,000 positive things and one negative thing, that David is not going to say, because you did so many good things, you automatically neutralize the bad thing that you did. Nor is David going to detract or subtract one of the good things that you did because of the Avera. They're two different systems. David will punish a person for that Avera, the single Avera, and reward the person for all of those mitzvahs. That, says the Rambam, is what it means not to, so to speak, for the Eibishter to accept a bribe. Says the Rambam, that is similar to the idea of not showing us favor, which is that the Eibishter takes somebody who's extremely advanced like Moshe Rabbeinu and is very harsh with them about minor things. Whereas the Eibishter rewards Esav with such a rogue for the fact that he had kibbud avayim. He did terrible things. Kibbud avayim, he gets rewarded. Nebuchadnezzar, because he gave the Eibishter covet. That's what it means. The Eibishter doesn't show favor. Everything is absolutely clinical. In other words, how we work out the net value of a person's mitzvahs and averos, it's not some kind of a transactional relationship between mitzvahs and averos, like people always say on the scale. That you think, okay, let the Eibishter subtract that avera from our mitzvahs and we're good, we're even. Rather, the way that the Eibishter created the world is the rewards for mitzvahs are the rewards for mitzvahs, and the punishments for averos are punishments of averos, and the one system does not impact the other. Why? One reason is this. The value of a mitzvah and the problem of an avera is not just with regards to the person who did the mitzvah of the avera, but they're two completely different realities. Doing a mitzvah is fulfilling the Eibishter's supernal will. And doing an avera means breaking the Eibishter's will. And therefore, every single mitzvah is its own category, bringing the Eibishter's will into this world, and an avera is the opposite. But even in that distinction, the two facets. There's an aspect of, so to speak, showing favor, and so to speak, accepting a bribe. And there's a very clear distinction between the two. Masei ponim means there's something about you that makes me want to show you favor or let go of an issue because there's something about you that's valuable. Whereas if it's accepting a bribe, there has to be a value to what you're offering me. It's not about you, it's about the value of what you're offering me. And you could see that in the impact on a judge. If a person has masei ponim, they say, you know what? I know you did something wrong, but it's not going to drop your stature in my eyes because I like you, I favor you. So therefore, the avera is not going to damage the perspective I have of you. I'm not going to look at you as somebody who's lacking, somebody who's a sinner. The more chassidish way to explain choyte is from lashon chesaron, and chet is from lashon chesaron. You don't have to necessarily be a bad person, but lacking. Whereas sheichad has nothing to do with you and how I see you. It's that there was a bad thing over here, and we've redeemed it. For example, by paying money, because money does that. Kofer has the capacity to redeem something. That's what the Mishnah is telling us beyond what the pasuk already taught us. The net value of my relationship with Hashem is not a collation of all the averos on one side and all the mitzvahs on another side. And a mitzvah does not cancel an avera. That also explains the medrash that suggests that tshuva is a form of bribery. Says the medrash, you Hashem accept bribes from the wicked in this world, which is tshuva u'maisim tovim u'tfilah. Right? That you accept. You Eibusha, you accept from the Yidden. Tshuva maisim tovim tfilah. Masayim medrash asut tfilah tshuva. So therefore the medrash says, so go ahead and do it. Because the impact of tshuva is something which is exponentially beyond the impact of Torah mitzvahs. Done in our context, it's like vitoy. That's not just the Eibusha, so to speak, says, okay, we're going to expunge all the negativity. The person is now considered a Baal Tshuva. And but actually changes the item. Sheichad changes the item. Again, Masei ponim is, I see you as okay, and I'll overlook what you did. Sheichad will say, what you're giving me now is so valuable that it transforms what was there before. It used to be an avera, now it's something positive, which is, at the lowest level, tshuva translates or transforms those deliberate averas that we did to be considered as if they were unintentional. And then a higher form of tshuva is able to take things that we did that were bad and make them as if they were merits. Or we could get to the highest level, which is that the averas become literally our merits. That's the power of sheichad. So loy makach sheichad. The Eibusha doesn't accept sheichad if a person has complete kabbalah, prikasol. But when a person does tshuva, then the Eibusha is mekabel sheichad, which means not just that he says, I love you despite what you've done, but to actually take what we've done and transform it from negative into positive as a result of our tshuva. And of course we know, that through that we should bring Mashiach now.